What's going on, everybody? Kalipa's Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the Samsung Galaxy A23 5G and going over everything you need to know about it to help you decide whether or not it's the right phone for you. Now before we go any further, as always, I do want to remind you to hit that subscribe button, and if you want to learn more about this phone, I will be linking to several other videos about it in the description, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and my favorite accessories for it. But with that being said, let's get into it. So as the name suggests, the Samsung Galaxy A23 5G is actually the successor to the Samsung Galaxy A22 5G that came out around mid-2021. But one big difference here is that with the Samsung Galaxy A23 5G, this phone is actually officially launched in the US, and you can even get some great carrier deals with it, whereas the A22 5G on the other hand is not officially a US phone. So it's definitely a nice thing in my opinion to get a real solid middle ground between an entry-level 5G phone like the Samsung Galaxy A13 5G for example, and a slightly higher end phone like the Samsung Galaxy A33 5G. But keep in mind there are several differences between this version and the international version, like for example the RAM and storage. With this phone we are getting 64GB of internal storage with microSD card expansion, whereas the international version, or at least some of the international versions, are going to have 128GB instead. Now this is a little too bad because 64GB, while at least being acceptable, is still not exactly ideal. In this day and age, stuff like apps and even the system itself take up more and more space, so 64GB, again while being at least decently acceptable for what it is going to fill up pretty quickly if you're more of a power user. So if you are in the US and you do tend to have a lot of apps and data and stuff like that, then I would recommend either getting the international version of this phone or getting a slightly higher end device like the Samsung Galaxy A53 5G for example that comes with more storage. Another noticeable difference between the US version of this phone and the international version is the RAM. Now this isn't really going to affect the performance or anything a whole lot, but all the same keep in mind the US version of this phone has 4GB of RAM, whereas the international version has 6GB. Again, while this does sound like a big difference, it's not really going to make a huge difference in the grand scheme of things, but all the same it is something to keep in mind. Now for the display on this phone, it is really good quality and I am happy with it for the most part. With the 6.6-inch 120Hz PLS LCD display that has an aspect ratio of 20:9, we're not only getting a larger display in general, but we're also getting a taller and more narrow form factor here. So if you're doing something like watching a video or playing a game in landscape mode for example, you're going to get a more immersive experience. And if you're doing something vertical like reading, scrolling through social media, or browsing the web, with this taller and more narrow kind of form factor, you can fit more content on the screen without having to scroll as much. And again, at 6.6 inches, sure it's not quite as big as something like the Motorola Moto G Stylus 5G for example, but it is definitely on the larger side. And of course, having a large display is always good for consuming content. When it comes to the image quality, this is also real good as well. With the 1080p resolution, everything is going to be real sharp and crisp, and the PLS LCD display, while not being something like a Super AMOLED for example, is still really nice and the colors and everything look great. So if you're consuming a lot of content, whether you're watching videos, playing games, even doing something really simple like looking at photos or browsing the web, it's all going to look great on this phone. And with the 120Hz refresh rate, the movement on the screen is going to be really fast and smooth, and this is going to give you a more fluid, premium feeling experience. Now earlier I said this display was great for the most part, so let's talk about what I don't like about it. And this is really one thing, but I feel like depending on your location, this one thing could be a little bit more significant. So when you're using this phone in a really bright setting, specifically outside in the sun, especially if you're wearing some kind of sunglasses, despite the viewing angles for the most part being pretty good, the phone is actually really hard to see in this kind of setting. Now at certain angles it is perfectly fine, but once you get into landscape mode, for whatever reason, it does get significantly harder to see. So if you are going to be outside in the sun a lot, maybe you live in an area like I do with a really bright sunny climate, in that kind of situation, you might want to consider getting something like a Samsung Galaxy A53 5G for example, that has an AMOLED display instead, and then you're not going to have that issue. But otherwise, if you're mostly indoors or you're just not typically in really bright areas, then you should be completely fine here. But aside from that issue that could be really small or more major depending on how you're actually using the phone, I do think that for what it is, the Samsung Galaxy A23 5G has one of the best displays in this price range. Now when it comes to security features, like most A-series phones, the Samsung Galaxy A23 5G has a fingerprint scanner and face unlock, giving us two options to get into it. The fingerprint scanner for this phone is on the power key, and while not looking quite as premium as the in-display fingerprint scanners on stuff like the Samsung Galaxy A53 5G for example, having a fingerprint scanner on the power key is a real convenient spot and arguably a lot faster than most in-display fingerprint scanners too. And of course, since again this phone does have face unlock, if you want to use that instead you always can. Now taking a look at the camera setup here, keep in mind this is going to be real quick because I am going to make a dedicated camera review for this phone as well. But to give you a quick rundown of the features here, we got a water drop notch for the front facing camera, pretty much the standard lower end A series look. This camera is 8 megapixels. On the back we got a full quad camera setup with a 50 megapixel main camera, a 5 megapixel ultra wide camera, a 2 megapixel macro camera, and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera. So in general this phone has all the features including an ultra wide camera and a macro camera. So if you're taking a lot of photos and you want a wider variety of features, for a mid-range phone, you're really not going to be disappointed here. To give you an idea of what the quality actually looks like, here's a couple photos taken with the main camera, definitely nowhere near the level of something like an S22 Ultra for example, but for a $300 mid-range phone, I would say it is pretty good. And here's a photo taken with portrait mode in the front-facing camera, again, definitely nowhere near as good as a $1,400 flagship phone for example, but really if you're just taking the occasional selfie or two, and you obviously want it to look good, but you don't need the absolute top-of-the-line quality, the Samsung Galaxy A23 5G will get the job done. Now again, I didn't want to spend too much time on the camera here because I am going to be making a full video on just that. So if you do want to see a more in-depth analysis on the camera setup, definitely check out the video description because as soon as it's up, I will be linking to it there. But overall, if you're expecting this phone to take better photos than an iPhone, you will be disappointed because after all, this is a $300 phone. But if you just want to take nice photos for social media, for example, and you want some other features like an ultra-wide camera, macro camera, and stuff like that, I do think as long as you're not expecting top-of-the-line quality, you will get a good camera experience with this phone. Now when it comes to video, this phone can record in 1080p in both the rear and front cameras, no 4K unfortunately, but really compared to other phones in this price range, at least brand new ones, you're really not going to find a whole lot of phones, if any, that can actually record in 4K. So if you are recording a lot of videos and you do want that higher resolution, in that case you're probably better off with the Samsung Galaxy A53 5G that can record in 4K. But again, for more basic use, although the Samsung Galaxy A23 5G can't record in 4K, I do think the 1080p videos still do look really good. Now when it comes to the RAM and processor, like I said before, this phone does have 4GB of RAM in the US, but the international version, or at least some of them, have 6GB of RAM instead. Now that being said, the processor we're getting here is the Qualcomm Snapdragon 695 5G processor, so definitely a real good processor. The performance, while maybe not being quite as good as some of the higher end Samsung phones, is still really impressive, especially for this price range. So if you're going to be on your phone a decent amount and you're doing slightly higher performance activities like some mobile gaming for example, then I do think this phone is going to be a great choice for that. But keep in mind, when it comes to those higher performance activities, if you really just focused on that, playing Call of Duty all the time for example, and really just doing things that take up a lot of power, this phone, while being powerful for what it is still not going to be nearly as fast as a much higher end phone. So if you are really more of a power user, and you really want to get that high end performance, then I would definitely suggest getting something like a Samsung Galaxy S21 FE that has truly flagship level performance. But again, for more moderate activities, the Samsung Galaxy A23 5G in my experience does perform really well. Now in case you're wondering, I did run a Geekbench 5 benchmark test on this phone, and here are the scores right here. What I recommend doing is running this test on your current phone and comparing your results to these, and that's going to give you a better idea of whether or not this phone will be an upgrade for you, because depending on which you're coming from, your current device might even be faster. Now another thing I really like about this phone is the battery. This phone has a 5000 mAh battery that supports 25 watt fast charging, so with the 5000 mAh battery, in the US at least, that's pretty much the largest battery you can get in a smartphone, so you can expect to get great battery life and longevity here. And when it comes to fast charging, 25 watt fast charging, while still not being the best in the world, for a phone in this price range is definitely real good. So if you're in a situation where you don't always have a lot of time to charge your phone, this is definitely going to be a nice thing. I know for me personally, I always like to have my phone ready to go at all times, so it's always nice to be able to charge it really fast. Now that being said, keep in mind, without a fast charger, you can't really make the most of this phone's charging speeds. So of course, with 25 watt fast charging, you are going to need a 25 watt charger. But that being said, if you don't have one, but you still do want to be able to take advantage of your phone's fast charging, I will be linking to my favorite fast charger in the video description. This thing is insanely powerful, while also being really compact and also pretty affordable. So if you're interested, definitely check that out. But in general, as far as the battery goes, definitely a big strength here. So if battery life, longevity, charging speeds, or all of them are priorities for you, the Samsung Galaxy A23 5G will be a great choice. Now as far as software goes, as of right now, this phone does have Android 12. I imagine there will be an update to Android 13 coming real soon. And keep in mind, when it comes to a Samsung Galaxy A series phone, you're going to get at least 5 years of software support. So if you like to have the latest version of Android and you want to get as many major updates as you can, the Samsung Galaxy A23 5G, or really any Samsung phone for that matter, is going to be a great choice. Another thing to keep in mind here is that with this phone, we are getting NFC. So if you like to make contactless mobile payments using Tap and Pay, you will be able to do that just fine with this phone. But in conclusion, my general thoughts about the Samsung Galaxy A23 5G. In general, I do think this is a really good phone for what it is. Sure, it's not perfect. Again, I really don't like how it handles high lighting. Like I said, when you're in the sun, for example, at certain angles, it is really hard to see. The storage, for the US version at least, is, while not terrible, still pretty mediocre. In this day and age, 64GB, while at least being better than 32, is still not ideal for a lot of people. And even though, yeah, on one hand, pretty much no phone in this price range can record 4K videos, it's always disappointing when a device with such good performance and such a high quality camera still can only record videos in 1080p. But in general, other than a few minor drawbacks, I do think this is a great phone, and if you're looking for something with great performance, a large battery, a nice camera setup, a really good looking display, a newer software, and features like NFC, all for a really affordable price, then you're really not going to go wrong with this phone. But this concludes my review of the Samsung Galaxy A23 5G. Again, if you want to learn more about it, I will be linking to several other videos about the phone in the description, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and my favorite accessories for it. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kalipas Tech on Twitter and Instagram. And as always, I will see you in the next video.